Someone once told me that if I cared about my spiritual growth, I should find people who demonstrated evidence of the Spirit's work in their lives and follow them. One way I can do this is to study biographies. I can also learn from experts and leaders by reading their books, listening to their sermons or podcasts, and following them on social media. The best way is to find someone within your own community, even your own church, who appears to prioritize following God with all their heart, and ask them if you can meet with them on a regular basis. It isn't always easy taking this kind of initiative. I've read biographies of various heroes of the faith, some of them multiple times. I follow a few people online because I'm curious to see how they navigate their faith in these crazy times. I have found that finding people to speak into my life on a regular basis has been difficult. The only time I had this type of relationship was for a couple years when I lived in Illinois. I asked a pastor who always impressed me with his wisdom if he'd be willing to meet with me regularly. I very much miss having that relationship. I miss having a godly man who helps me to know and honor Jesus better in all the areas of my life. At this point in our overview, we've looked at a number of biblical heroes of the faith. We looked at Abraham and considered his relentless belief against all hope in God's promises. His son and grandson, Isaac and Jacob, exhibit this same belief. We looked at Moses and his love for God's children and his commitment to leading them toward the promised land. We looked at Joshua, who had the courage to lead in the shadow of a giant like Moses. Then we looked at Judges, and we learned about what it is like when sinners decide to do whatever they want. Even then, the devotion of Ruth and the kindness of Boaz showed us that godly people still exist, even in the midst of extreme idolatry and immorality. Samuel showed us how to honor the Lord even when you've been trained by a not-so-good mentor and still have an impact leading fickle people. Then there was the first king of Israel, Saul. He was reluctant but impressive, passionate but arrogant. And now we have David, and he's just a mixed bag, and sometimes I'm not sure what to think of him. I scratch my head and wonder because I'm sure that there had to be a better man after God's own heart. However, I'm not God, and I know I cannot see the whole picture. A moment ago, I used that phrase, heroes of the faith. Can you see the problem with this phrase? Is it true that we should be following the examples of these biblical figures?
David was one of the men in the Bible that God said he was a man after my own heart. What a tremendous way of describing King David. Yet here's also a man who committed murder so that he can sleep with that man's wife. He's a murderer, he's an adulterer.
Abraham, the father of our faith, we always say. Abraham's a guy that lied, threw his wife under the bus, not once, but twice. I mean, this is not a husband that you want to emulate.
Do you see that the Bible takes care to tar virtually every biblical figure but one?
You see, Paul writes, there is no one righteous, not even one. If that's the case, then is following someone like David setting the bar far too low? There's a difference between learning from someone and following their example. Again, Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 10 concerning the stories in the Old Testament. Now these things took place as examples for us so that we will not desire evil things as they did. And then he says, here's your example. He writes a chapter later to imitate me as I also imitate Christ. So, when do we follow the examples of others? Only as far as their examples reflect the character and commands of Jesus. Still, David is called a man after God's own heart, and to that end, I want to discover what it looks like to be after God's heart, and how David's life can point me to Jesus. In today's stories, we will see several sides of David: the good and bad, commendable and deplorable. Will you be able to find what points to Jesus? More importantly, will you be able to be like David in the ways that show the goodness of God's forgiveness? Consider how David manages to run after God, as messed up as he is. Can you manage to scrape your own sin-stained self up and run after God with the same kind of transparency, vulnerability, and humility that David displayed? I hope as you're looking at David's examples, you respond by running harder to Jesus. Choosing to respond to God the way David did can be a very scary first step. However, it's necessary if you want to become the type of person who responds to your sin by running after the heart of God with repentance and openness. Help one another find the courage and strength to do this.